Good morning. Welcome to the next in our Navigating the Blizzard webinar series, aimed at helping you work through and think through and process a lot of what is going on during this critical time. And I'm sure as I've been doing, a lot of you have been watching the numbers, and some significant thresholds obviously passed in the last 24 hours. Over 1 million people verified to have been infected. Obviously, lots of questions about how many there actually are. Countries going crazy, lockdowns, 25 to 35% of the planet under enforced lockdowns, and businesses obviously battling and struggling. And so today what we want to talk about is we want to spend a bit of time and, in a sense, consolidating a lot of what we've covered up until now. And so what I want to cover is reflect a little bit and think about how do we grow a healthy, sustainable business that can weather any storm. Now, obviously, we're in crisis. And so some of the thinking is I'm going to try to focus where I can on what things we need to focus on at the moment, because a critical part of thinking as governors is to identify the areas which we can address immediately. And so part of the process will be to ask questions, and possibly I need to apologize up front. I was reflecting on a lot of the videos, and I think we are asking more questions than we are answering. But I suppose that's the key thing we need to be doing in this time, is to really identify the questions we need to be asking so that we can think through what is lying ahead of us, what we're going through, and what is lying ahead of us. And as we've said, this is what Navigating the Blizzard is all about. It's about helping you to determine the next steps to take in your business. And so I will reflect on some of the previous webinars, and I encourage you to revisit them, because all of these are different aspects of what we need to think through as we govern our businesses. And so it's thinking about the impact and implications of those steps, systematically thinking in a way that is efficient, effective, and leads us to the right conclusions, or a substantially right conclusion given the changing environment, and then take the decisions. Absolutely critical is decision making, and we did cover that last time, but I was reminded once again of how important it is to really focus on making decisions so that we can move and testing those decisions, because often we'll make a decision that isn't great, but it's only by moving that we understand and we can see that we need to do something else, and then we can make another decision. And then position yourselves to see this thing through. There are parts of our businesses that we probably need to, hunker down and park for some of this time. Other parts of our businesses that we need to be far more aggressive on. And as we go, please ask questions and engage using the Q&A or the chat boxes. Those are in front of me, and please also take notes. These are designed to be working webinars because they're part of us processing our thinking about what's going on and helping those people we work with to do the same. As we like to do, we like to start with a bit of a personal account. And what I do generally is I travel around a lot to various parts of Africa, and I spend a lot of my time on my feet. I will often spend 2 or 3 days in a week standing for 8 to 10 hours. And so I decided I obviously need to get into the exercise routine. The problem is in lockdown, one has choices. One can either pull out, as I have a little set of gym stuff I call my gym in a bag that I do travel with, and it includes a skipping rope and some of those stretchy bands and things you can hook on doors. And so I've done a couple of workouts using that. And then I thought, let me try, because I started to see people doing the marathons in a backyard. I'm definitely not going to do that, but I did start to run. And so I set up in my mind a course around my house, and then I thought I'd test it out. And what was amazing is this is the picture that I got when I tracked it on Strava. This was the second run that I did. The first one was just a couple of laps, but what was fascinating for me is that I'm effectively traveling all over Africa when I run around my house. When I get to the end of my driveway, I live in a cul-de-sac. I'm effectively at the Cape Town point of that picture. When I come up down past my garage, I'm going through Kenya, and when I'm right around the other side of my house, gone past around my garden, and I'm very privileged to be live in a house that I can run around. I'm popping into Ghana, and those are the regions that I regularly go to on a monthly basis as I travel in the normal course of things. And so I thought that was really interesting. I posted this on our leadership team group, and it's just really interesting that sometimes there's an inadvertent, and I didn't even need to change the orientation. The orientation of the run and the runs that I'm going to be doing over this lockdown period are pretty much my traveling schedule throughout Africa. So wherever you're sitting, please note that I do pay attention to you as I do my runs, and it's regular, because when I run, that was, I think, 8 laps I had to do to get, and I won't give you the distance, it wasn't very far. So that's a personal, we're all going through these things, and we're all having to make sense of some of the challenges that we face. And so look out for the interesting correlations and the interesting coincidences and the interesting things that happen during this time, because what we need to be doing is we need to really be thinking through everything that we are going through. And this is a quote I did use last time, and in reflecting, I thought it's really an important one. Crises and deadlocks, when they occur, have at least the advantage that they force us to think. And then in my reflecting on that, I thought, well, it's most important to ensure that when we think, we also learn. And this is a really critical time in our businesses and in our personal lives to be asking the questions, what are we really learning from what's happening? And so part of today's webinar is also to reflect on that and say, how can we learn and implement in our businesses what we are learning? And this is another quote that is similar. Never let a serious crisis go to waste. Obviously, he is in that case quoting Winston Churchill. And he says, what I mean by that is it's an opportunity to do things you did not think you could do before. I didn't realize I could run numerous kilometers by just going around my house. Those people who've run the marathon on a 32-foot long balcony in France, people are doing things they've never thought possible. And so again, in reflecting, we need to link our thinking to our learning to our doing. And I do encourage you, as these have been working webinars, they're helping me in my position in the business I'm involved in to think through what I do. But let's link our thinking to our learning to our doing. And that's one of the key elements of governance thinking. Thinking as boards, thinking as leaders, is we've got to link our thinking to our learning to our doing. And one of the things we've all been looking at, I'm sure, is lots and lots of graphs. And I had this sent to me by a friend a couple of days ago. All these graphs we're looking at, the months of 2020, we're into April, obviously, but time spent looking at exponential graphs has been going up and up and up. And so we've been seeing things like, and learning terms that we've never thought about before. We've thought about flattening curves. We've thought about, what does that look like? What are we trying to do when we flatten curves? Are we going to go through that kind of curve, or are we going to go for that kind of curve? Or what is it going to look like? Is it going to be a single, or is it going to be a double? Or is it going to be more? We're seeing lots and lots of curves. We're exposed to words that we didn't even know we could say, like epidemiological. And I did practice that. Epidemiological models and how they make sense and what we're looking at. We're looking at exponential growth. Great opportunity for the maths teachers to teach something that is real world in the classroom. But if we don't ask ourselves, and in looking at all these models, these are all projections of the future. And as you would have seen in some of the webinars, and we're going to talk about it today, is the primary thing that governors need to do is they need to have a clear picture of what they anticipate the future to be. Now, obviously, it's not a forecast of the future, but it's anticipating what the future holds. And the purpose of all these graphs at the end of the day, we've got to ask ourselves, what are we really learning from all of these graphs and all of these numbers? We're learning that ultimately what we do today can and does change what happens tomorrow. You see, one of the dangers of a lot of these graphs is we're seeing graphs happen, and then we're seeing action taken, and then we're seeing the graph doesn't turn out like the graph was going to turn out. And people criticize and say, well, we were all locked down for no reason. We didn't make, it was overreaction. And yet the very reason for the lockdown was because we were trying to avoid the graphs moving in some directions, and we were trying to encourage the graph to move in other directions. And so when we think about the future as leaders, we've got to ask the question, how do we link the future to what we do in the present? Because what we do in the present is going to take us where we're going on. And some of the things we can do in the present are we can think about how do we structure our businesses? How do we architect our businesses? And the reason I use the word architect as opposed to build our businesses is that the work of governors is often and primarily a work of design before it is a work of doing or building. And what we need to be doing is we need to be stepping back from our businesses, and we need to be looking at them at arm's length and saying what needs to be renovated, what needs to be changed, what's working, what's the strong parts of this vehicle, this thing, this place that we have, the space that we are governing, what's good about it and what's bad about it, what's working and what's not working. And so the architect takes a step back. The architect envisions the final picture, envisions the final building, but the architect must act before the builder acts. We've all seen those houses where the builders acted first, and some of us have been involved in those houses, and those houses are often not the best houses and not the easiest buildings to work in. And so when we architect a business, we have to think about what must we take into account. So what are the elements of this business? What are the types of thinking? And then where should we begin? And I want to try to answer those two questions to start the building or rebuilding process. And for some of our businesses, we are having to renovate. We're having to take down and remove, and sometimes in this crisis, it's dangerous and it's harmful, and we've got to be careful about how we do that. Some of our businesses are able to build a brand new wing, build a brand new part of the business because of the opportunities that lie there. And so that's one of the metaphors that I think is powerful. The other one is the one that we mentioned earlier, which is the word governor or governance comes from the picture of the captain of the ship. And so in architecting a business, it's the flip side of metaphor is it's planning the journey. So what journey are we going on? Because our businesses aren't just static buildings. Our businesses are vehicles that travel through time. And I think that's one of the critical things about a governor is that the governor looks forward into the future. The captain of the ship has to understand what destination they want to achieve and reach, and then look back and ask the question, what directions do we need to take? And so destination and direction and the gap between these two is critical in thinking about, as we've mentioned in a couple of the webinars, stakeholders, risk, all of those things lie in this gap. The other element as a foundation for today and thinking about our businesses is what I covered in the first webinar, where I covered something called the law of requisite variety. And I went through it in a little bit of more detail then, but essentially it's saying, how does a system, the business we're in, how does that system deal successfully with the challenges that its environment produces? And if a system, what the law of requisite variety says is that if the system is to be able to deal successfully with the diversity of challenges that its environment produces, then it needs, in other words, the system needs to have a repertoire of responses which is at least as nuanced as the problems thrown up by the environment. And so when we're thinking about growing, building, architecting a business that is resilient and that lasts, we've got to ask ourselves the question, how do we build into our systems and our businesses a repertoire of responses? And what is our repertoire of responses? Maybe part of the thinking at the moment is to relook at your business's repertoire of responses. And we spoke in this about the fact that performance in a business comes from, so for a business to perform, it's a combination of the people in the business, and sometimes that repertoire of responses is in our people, and very, very important to have the right people. But also we've got to be asking ourselves the question as well, what systems do we need to build so that the combination of our people and our systems is where our performance comes from? And we'll touch on that as well. And a mature business tends to have more systematized and rely on its people to do what people do best, which is deal with the exceptions. And the viable system in this is one that can handle the variability of its environment, and only variety can absorb variety. And so in thinking about and building our businesses, we have to ask the question, to what extent can we legitimately reduce the variety? And that's typically a system element. if we reduce it to nothing, so the challenge with systematization is if it goes too far, it becomes its own problem. It becomes fragile because it's not resilient. But certain things, if there's no structure, then we wouldn't be able to, I mean, if our bodies didn't have a form of structure, our skeletal system, we wouldn't be able to stand upright. All right. But at the same time, that skeletal system needs the ability to move. And so the increasing variety is also about how do we get that balance? And that's often in our people. So how do we deal with the things that we are thinking about? And so we touched on that a little bit. One of the other metaphors, and I'm putting a lot out there, but please process it, is to think about what in our businesses do we need to construct and what do we need to cultivate. Because often what we do is we try to construct what can only be cultivated, and we try to cultivate what can only be constructed. What I mean by that is our businesses are this combination of things that are growing and developing. Our organizational culture is not something that is engineered or constructed. It's something that grows and develops over time. And our values and the things that we speak about, and I'll touch on that later. But the construction, the processes, the procedures, the systems in the business, we need to continually be looking at and building and rebuilding. And so it's this combination of these two metaphors of the architect and the architecture and agriculture, the architect and the farmer. What are they working with? And they work in different ways. So in this vineyard that the picture is of, is we have elements of architecture, the trellises that are holding up elements of agriculture, the vines that actually are what it is all about. And so an architect, even when they're building a building, they build it for usability, for what's the life that happens in it. And so our businesses need to be built not just for what they are, but for what they facilitate and what they enable. And in this time, we've got to ask ourselves the question, what are those based on? Also touched on the link between the words rooted and radical. And I said these are two, in a sense, linked words because they mean the same thing. And we often think that they mean different things. But the Latin word for root is the word radical. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that what we in our businesses, we want to be radical, we want to be wild, we want to be able to do things out there and to have these crazy wild businesses that are radical and that are big and that are vast. But unless they are built and grown on deep rootedness, the surface elements become very fragile and not resilient. So the resilience of the business is about growing both down as well as up. And another thought I had there, or thought that was triggered by someone else's phrase, was our rootedness, all right, determines what routes we can take. And so linking those two metaphors, that it's not only a static element, but there is a journey in time that we are growing, building, cultivating our businesses for. And then our businesses consist of not just, as often we think about, our assets and our activities, but it's the people in the business, the relationships we have in the business that tie everything together. And so when we think about architecting, growing, cultivating, constructing, engineering our businesses, all of those metaphors together, we need to ask ourselves what type of thinking is appropriate to different things. The assets of the business, the formalities of financial matters are normally around, are things that can be engineered and structured and analyzed. The activities have to be planned and project managed and thought about in terms of a flow and dependencies. The relationships have to be strong and have to be properly set in place to facilitate the flow of the business. And so in thinking about structuring our business, different types of thinking apply to those different areas. And so with that foundation in mind, I want to start at a high level and work my way down in terms of thinking. So the work of the board, work of what tools do boards use to actually get the business built in a way that is resilient and then linked. And one of the challenges I think that is going to be primary going forward is to understand that there is in a sense a codependency between the role of the board and the role of management. And we've often seen those things as separate. We often see the board as more involved in the formalities and the technicalities and the compliance issues. And often when we think the word governance or the role of the board, we automatically shift to the technicalities and the compliance issues in a business and the legal liability in a business. And it is obviously those things, but we seldom have the tension on the flip side that the work of the board is as much about the performance of the business as the work of management. And so we need to get that interdependency between the board and management revised and refreshed going through this challenge, because that'll set us up for success into the future. And so what does it look like, again, the work of the board? And it consists of a handful of elements, in a sense. And my thinking, as I've worked with boards for the last 10 plus years, is to really try to boil it down to, well, what are the essentials? Because we can get tied up in a lot of detail, and there is a lot of detail, and there's a lot of information in this governance or board space. But if we look at the essentials, and in a conversation a number of years ago, I was asked by a colleague, a friend, who said, well, what are the fundamental dimensions if you had to think about the core dimensions of governance? And so when we think about the primary dimensions we work with, we think about something that is three-dimensional, and we tossed around this idea that actually, if there was a Rubik's Cube, that obviously our businesses, we want them to be, clean, and that we want to solve the puzzle of the Rubik's Cube. But what are the three dimensions that board members need to be thinking about at all times? What do they need to keep in balance at all times? And the first dimension is definitely strategy. And we're going to reflect a little bit on this. So even in building our businesses, strategy must be primary. If we don't keep strategy in mind in the building of our businesses, then we end up with businesses that aren't able to achieve what we intend them to achieve. And so in strategic thinking, we've got to ask very, very clearly, well, what is actually going on here? What's actually happening in our businesses? And today is a time, this crisis is a time to do some in-depth, diligent, intense diagnosis to understand what exactly are the elements in the business that are working and what are not working, and diagnosis about both health and, illness in a sense. We've then got to understand what our approach to those issues are. So what are our underlying values? What are our underlying, ethos of the business? How do we address it in this business? We've got to be clear about that. And I'll dig a little bit into this during this time together. And then ultimately it must lead to, so strategic thinking must lead to both coherent and compelling action. What I mean by coherent is the actions we take must tie together. And often when I work with businesses, one of the challenges is that different people have different agendas. And so sometimes the coherence of the action is not strong enough. It's not aligned. And that's a word we hear often, but that needs to be both coherent and compelling. In other words, the steps you take must be meaningful. They must result in an outcome that can be tested and checked to verify whether we're moving in the right direction. So that's the first dimension, strategy. The second dimension of the work of the board is this concept of governance, is that we've got to really be thinking hard about how do we take strategy and apply the governance thinking to construct something that is going to deliver what it needs to deliver. And the key phrases there that have been used is, start at the bottom, is that ultimately it's a focus on outcomes. Governance must be built for an end in mind. Often governance is built to tick boxes, or governance is built to satisfy, retrospective challenges. We've had something go wrong in our business, and so we fix it by putting something, we remediate with our governance structures and processes, instead of asking what do we want to achieve by this at the end of the process. And governance consists of linking principles and practices, and part of this is the picture of going deep. Principles lie deep, practices lie on the surface, and so that rootedness that leads to radicalness is a critical thing. The stronger our practices need to be, the deeper we need to think about the principles that we base our businesses on. And that's where this concept of apply and explain is really, really important. So in the international context today, there are numerous codes of governance. There are numerous sets of recommendations. There are lots of books to buy and books to read through, whether those are, structured close to legislative frameworks or structured distant from them, whether they're for a specific sector or business or type of business. And it's very easy for us to ask the question, or just to simply, not even to ask the question, but to simply say, well, that worked there, it must work here. instead of asking the question, how do we actually apply to this context, to our business, to my business, to the business we're involved in, to the team sitting around the table, how do we apply what's happened there? How do we learn from that? So this thinking, learning, doing is a critical, concept that is important around our boardroom tables. And then how do we put an explanation together? So our application of governance principles must be well explained, because it's in our explanation that we can test whether it's valid. And if it's challenged, we can then present the explanation as our defense. And that's critical to think about governance. And so we'll touch on that concept as we go through today's conversation as well. And in thinking about strategy and governance, those are often seen as the two key elements. But the third dimension, I really believe, that is emerged and is emerging is this combined dimension of stakeholders and risk. And what I mean by that is, remember we said in the captain of the ship, so the ship is here sailing along in that direction, the future is here. It's between these two, the present and the future, that our impact on stakeholders and the risks we face reside or lie. It's in the space, it's in the gap between the now and the not yet. It's in the space between what is and what is yet to be. It's in the space, between where we are and where we want to be and our desired future. And so a critical part of decision making is to understand that decision making impacts the future, and decision making in a governance context must take into account who we impact and what other things are going to influence our ability to achieve what we want to achieve. And so it's really critical in thinking about stakeholders and risk, or risks and stakeholders, to have that view, is we need to anticipate the impact early. We spoke one of the previous webinars about decision making. Decision making has to start with the anticipated end in mind. We've got to think impact, and we'll touch on that as well. We need to be proactive and not reactive. Too much of our governance is reactive, to the point that people are calling what we're going through now a black swan event. And if you know the definition of a black swan event, it's something that was unanticipatable. It was something that was never ever experienced before. It wasn't even thought about. And so the metaphor, the picture comes from, the first people that went from Europe to Australia only believed that you had white swans, and they came to Australia, and in Australia there are black swans. And so something that was outside the realm of possibility. What we're going through today, the crisis we're going through today, is not a black swan event, simply because it was anticipated. Even in my reflections and research in the last few days, I've come across numerous articles written in 2003, 2004, following SARS, following MERS, following all of those things. I listened to a talk by Bill Gates from 2014. He put a picture up on the slide, and it looked exactly like the picture we're seeing of the coronavirus. And he said, we're not prepared for this, because if we are proactive, then that helps focus our decision making. The problem is, most of our Rubik's cubes, we've got these dimensions mixed up. And so our businesses need to be rethought about. We've got to refresh them. We've got to think about them. And so what I want to do is, in the balance of our time together, is really think through, as I said, about how a business is put together. What elements does it consist of, and how do they work? And I'll be pulling on some of the elements we've spoken about already, but putting it all together. And it all does start with strategy. At the end of the day, it starts with anticipating, thinking about the future, and understanding where we are at the moment, and understanding the link. Our vehicle, the block on the left-hand side there, consisting of the different elements of the business, must be designed in such a way that it leads us towards our anticipated futures, our plausible futures. And we spoke a bit about scenario thinking last time. We've then got to ask ourselves what lies in the gap. And we unpacked this when we spoke about strategies. There's a gap between the present and the future where our assumptions lie, our expectations lie, where there's a lot of paradox, where there are things that move us forward, things that hold us back. And in today's world, we need to be re-examining all of our assumptions, re-examining all of our expectations. And that error has to be converted from a general picture of what this gap looks like to what are the key elements of the business we need to put together in time? What's dependent upon what, and how then do we link people into the equation? And how do we review it on an ongoing basis? We also spoke about the fact that governance must consider impact. And so impact of our businesses comes from the actions the business takes, comes from the decisions that we take in the boardroom or that we give away to other people in the business. And so one of the primary tools of governors is the policy framework. And so what I want to do today is spend a bit of time unpacking what does a policy framework actually do, and how do we architect the elements of a business. And then we've got to say, well, what underlies our decisions? And our decisions are undergirded by our thinking, how well we think as individuals, how well we think together. And our thinking always reflects our values, because our values are things that we as individuals carry around with us at all times. And so in architecting a business, we've got to also think about what do we put into our board processes, because our board process, or our decision-making process, another phrase on that would be our decision-making process, which, whether you've got a formal board or not, is a governance activity. See, the mistake we often make is we think, well, we don't have, in smaller businesses, we don't have a board, so we don't have to do the board stuff. But actually, every business needs to be governed. And that governance thinking has to be done by whoever leads the business. And technically, a company has a board from day one anyway, so there need to be processes in place. I was asked a question this last week: what do we do in a company the board hasn't met for 3 years? I said that's a problem, but it's been somehow governed, and that governance needs to be formalized for it to work. And so, in thinking about building our businesses, we've got to unpack those elements. How do we make sure that when we are making decisions, we've built a process of the right regularity of meetings, the right information in our board packs or information flows to our board, the right process of deciding in the room, facilitating the communication in the room, so that the decisions we make are substantially good. And then how do we make sure that the decisions we make result in the impact we anticipate? And so how do we roll the decisions through the company, through the actions of the company? The people in the company need to do what was decided so that we have the impact that was anticipated. And so that's thinking about policy framework. We also reflected on, and where I want to start in terms of thinking about the depth of thinking we need to go through. We spoke about decision making last time, and we said there's this flow of communication. We need to go through a process of divergent thinking, dialogue, so we get as much information into the decision as possible. And this is part of our thinking process to reach a decision. We need to discuss it, analyze it, work through it. And what I want to unpack today is what I've got at the bottom of that slide. How do we think about purpose, values, priorities, etc., so that in our discussions we can have robust debates and come to a decision? And so if we take those elements on that slide and we think again about another 2 dimensions that need to be balanced. So here I've taken that element from the underlying promise or purpose of a business, the values we want to express, what becomes priorities in what we do and how we do things, reflected in our practices and our actions, and then the people elements who have to do what we get them to do, what we need them to do. And that's essentially what a policy framework does. It ties the purpose of the business through to the people, or ties the people to the promise or the purpose. But it's also critical to recognize that there is always, as I've mentioned, this dimension in time. So this is the future, all right? This is the present, where we are at the moment, and obviously we can look back and we can learn from what we've done. But the other key dimension we need to think about is that in the present, there is this depth and there is this height, in a sense, or the rootedness and the radicalness. And in a business, there are 2 key elements. There is what I call visible, and the visibility is obviously the people, the practices, and the action, and then there is the invisible. And we've got to think that when we architect a business, we've got to take both into account. We're obviously building elements that are visible, but they are rooted or based on what is invisible. And if we unpack that and maybe use slightly different words, we often talk about organizational values, and we use in the organizational values space words that are like integrity and excellence and customer centricity. But our values ultimately, if we need to go deeper, reflect what we fundamentally believe to be true. And what we believe to be true is something that is encapsulated in the purpose or the reason for the business. And so that's where the link between purpose and values comes from. And then on the surface, what is visible to the outside world is what our businesses do on a regular basis, the habits in the business, and obviously the people are the ones who do that stuff. And some of those are very good, and we need to be in our businesses promoting the right set of habits and promoting the right things, the right regular things, and they reflect our behaviors. But it's this link that is often challenging, and a word that actually links the two together is the word ethics. And ethics comes from the Greek word ethos, and what the ethos of a place is or a business is, it's what is viewed from the outside and what is assumed about what's on the inside. So it's the link between the visible and the invisible. And so I encourage you, in terms of thinking about architecting your business, you've got to start with saying, what do we fundamentally believe to be valuable? How does that reflect in the behaviors we want? And what habits do we need to build during this time? And that type of thinking is known as policy thinking or polity thinking. And policy comes from the French word policy, which means the highest level of organizational thought and action that is designed to achieve the fundamental purpose of the enterprise or the organization. And the elements of strategy are as follows. And these are the ways to think about your business. Is the first thing to think about in your business is, what are the parts of the business that have to be governed? And how do we form those parts, and how do we identify those parts? And so critical thinking here is that the parts are formed by creating or defining the space or spaces that need to be governed. And whether we use, and I'll come back to the slide, but whether we use a tool like the business model canvas, the operational parts of the business, and how are those changing and how are we thinking about those? And we spoke in one of the previous webinars about examining whether things have changed. So has our value proposition changed? Has the space of our value that we offer changed? Has our customer relationship changed? Has the nature of our customer base changed? So we've got to look and see, how do we understand the different parts of the business? And then what do we do? Who do we work with? Because it's in establishing the boundaries that separate what needs to be separated. Because one of the challenges in business is giving the right accountability to the right parts of the business. And often when we haven't done that clearly and designed the business properly in terms of the parts to create the right distinctions, then putting them together, which you'll see as the next phase, becomes difficult. And so we've got to unpack before we repack. And in redesigning, we've got to take apart before we put together again. Also, what the boundaries do is they protect what needs to be protected. And critical concept in governance is there are different interests in each of these parts. There's an interest that lies with our employees. There's an interest that lies with our suppliers. There's an interest that lies with our customers. We've got to separate those out and protect the interests that we need to protect. It also helps us identify what the right things are. And so part of the process of governing is stepping back and re-looking at our business, re-examining it from a distance so that we can get an idea of what the parts look like. Once the parts have been identified, then we need to relate them together. We need to link them together in an appropriate way. And this is an important aspect of building a resilient business, is we've got to re-examine the parts and then re-relate them together. And so the process is not one that is only one of those elements. We can't change the parts without seeing how they affect the relationships. And how we relate the parts together is linked in what I call the 4 flows. And these are the 4 things that are governed in a relationship. And this is a policy framework would incorporate accountability in the relationship, and that always flows in a sense up. So the board is ultimately accountable for everything that happens in a business. The board needs to give away two flows that I call responsibility and authority. And effectively what this is doing is it's giving away the decision making in the business. This is what a policy framework does. It gives it to the CEO, who then needs to decide what do they retain and what do they give away to others. And every level of the business is the retention of responsibility and authority at a level and the giving away of the rest. So that ultimately all of the authority and responsibility is properly distributed throughout the business so that the business can operate and perform. And remember, this is the key thing of the systems in the business. The systems in our business do the giving away of responsibility and authority through our job descriptions, our delegations of authority, and all of those things. And then absolutely critical that people are held to account for what they are given responsibility and authority for. And that's why disclosure is absolutely important. And the reason disclosure is an important word is because it's more than just reporting. It's more than just a list of things that happened, but it's disclosing how the decisions were made, how the responsibility and authority was exercised. And then that ultimately flows back into accountability, which is where it all began at the beginning. And so absolutely critical in our policy frameworks is we've got to design this well. Because if we don't design it well, a few things happen. If we don't design it well, what we find is that either we get an overlap. So responsibility and authority, and in this overlap, it's very difficult because the person who is here and the person who is here either don't know or argue about what's in between. And so what this tends to lead to in our businesses is inertia. If we're finding that things aren't happening, people are blaming other people, it's probably because we need to separate out those two elements so there's a clearer definition. The other problem we have, though, is we often have these gaps. And so people say, well, it's not my job, it's their job, and yet we've got areas in our policy framework of question marks around the responsibility and authority. In that space, things don't happen. And so it's important to diagnose properly. If there's inertia in the business, then it could be because of that. If there are things not happening in the business, it could be because of the gap. And so at this time, it's important to really think about what you are doing. And the policy framework is what ties together decisions to actions to impact, ultimately. It's the relationships between the decision makers, or ultimately the board or the governors in the business, that essentially flow down to management or operations, which have an impact on stakeholders. And so thinking about it, the nature of our policy framework is absolutely critical. And yet policy frameworks are often not thought about in terms of linking together the relationships that need to be, the parts of the business that need to be linked together. So use this as a diagnosis tool in your own businesses to say, well, what parts do we need to think about and what are the relationships? And the question is, when we link people and parts, it results in performance. See, the performance of the business comes from the systems and the people that we've mentioned before, and they need to be related. They can't be kept separate. All right, you can see there is a person there. That person needs to be linked into the system appropriately. And when we think about the people, we've got to ask the question, if we take the word responsibility, the policy framework answers the question, who is getting the ability and imperative to respond? And the reason a lot of businesses are going through challenges right now is because we don't really know who's accountable for the response. Things are happening and we haven't thought about it up front. We see it happening in governments around the world. Who's actually going to make a decision? Are we going to let the medical people make a decision? Are we going to rely on this information? When are we going to decide? Because it hasn't been pre-thought. It hasn't been designed with the future in mind. It's been designed simply retrospectively, or just as this is the way we've always done it around here. And then we have the key element. The third element, obviously, is then once we have the parts and the relationships, we can run a process. Now, whether that's the board or the decision-making or the governance process, all right, processes operate within the parts and the relationships that are linked together. And what a process does is a process enables a policy to work. What I mean by that is the policy only works if it flows decisions to actions to impact. And that's one part of the business, all right, that is absolutely critical. But where many of our businesses are weak is this ability to think deeply about our values, ask what information do we need in this thinking space, and how do we actually think together as a whole group of people around a table to result in a decision. So it's everything from how often we meet, all right, to who meets in which meeting, all right, to who facilitates the thinking process. The role of the chairperson becomes absolutely critical because they facilitate the thinking in the room. The role of the company secretary, that is primarily accountable for administering this process so that there is a link. Because obviously the compliance with that process is where our defense comes in as directors. And then how do we flow? What documentation is there in this process that links our thinking, our dialogue to our discussion, to our debate, to our decisions? We often have resolutions coming out of these processes, but what's behind those resolutions? And so all of that is in our board process. And the important thing about that is that ultimately, when our companies have an impact, those parties who are impacted don't ask questions about what did we do and how did we decide. They make an assumption immediately about what the values of the business are. So right now there are governors who are being challenged because they've always said to their people, we all treat you as important, but the first things companies are doing are laying off people. Some of us in South Africa saw last week where the CEO of Edcon reflected incredible values, because he said actually, and the word he used was I'm gutted, because he said we've got to pay our people, but he acknowledged that at the same time there were other people he couldn't pay. And so making sure that our values are linked to the impact is a critical part of this whole process. And that's why board process, what we do in the boardroom, as well as our policy frameworks, need to be examined with this in mind. And then we've got to think about how do we actually, renew or review and reimagine what we're doing. And this is the process we have this. And I know that it's a crisis, and there is a lot happening. Some of us are busier than we've ever been before, to some extent. But I do think we need to, and do believe strongly that we need to use this as an opportunity. Remember the quotes up front? Unless we actually think, unless we actually learn, unless we actually do the right things, we are missing this opportunity. And so if we think about the structure or the sequence of thinking and redesigning, there's a way to think about the tools we have available. And this is, if we put it on a risk continuum and say, well, if we had a focus on certain elements of the business, we've spoken about strategy, we've spoken about compliance, we've spoken about assurance elements in making sure that the business performs. Where's the most important place to start, and how do they link together? And the most important place to start is to understand that the strategic elements in our business are the fundamental areas to focus on. It's not valuable to spend a lot of time rethinking, whether we are, I don't want this to come across wrong, but whether our compliance structures are in place. That's obviously important. But right now we need to be asking questions around strategy. And those are things like strategy, risk, stakeholders. And we'll unpack that briefly. Second thing we need to do is make sure that governance, but we can't just look at our governance frameworks and rewrite policies in this time if we haven't rethought about the strategic elements, because there's a dependency. And you'll see these percentages, they're not, this is as much art as it is science. Then the compliance elements, absolutely critical in this time, is to understand what compliance challenges there are going to be. We need to act legally, compliantly, in line with our values, absolutely essential, but doing that isn't going to manage or govern the bulk of the risk. And then our assurance elements of the business. Assurance often works in what I call the exception space. It helps validate or verify what's happened and identify what we need to do going forward. And what each of these looks like is when we think about our strategic elements. And so building a resilient business right now is we've got to look at our business model and our strategy. We've got to be examining, as we've said, we've got to be looking at the elements of the business quite critically and asking ourselves the question, where are the right elements to focus on? given the urgency, given the speed, given all of the things that are happening, we probably can't look at everything, but we need to identify the focus area to think about. We need to identify the focus area and describe it properly. We need to ask ourselves the question, what is the diagnosis? Why do we need to think and focus on these areas? And that means that a key part of strategy is also performance. I know we often put this on at the end, but I think one of the thinking about strategy, we've also got to think about our people. And so our people and the performance criteria in our businesses consist of a cluster of things that I call capability, capacity, and culture, the 3 C's of performance. And we've got to ask ourselves the question at this time, what are the capabilities in our people that are going to lead us to success? Has the skill set changed? So many of our people are working from home. That's a completely different skill set from going to an office. And feedback I'm getting from various people, family members, friends, colleagues are saying, actually, they didn't realize, some of the challenges. Some people are saying, well, people are going to be so glad to get back to work because this working from home thing isn't quite what it's cracked up to be. And so are there skills? Are there new skills of relating? How do you have client meetings when you can't sit face to face? Capacity issues in the business. So where are we going to need more people and where are we going to need less people? As the business changes, as our businesses are tested in terms of their variety and variability, and remember the repertoire of responses we spoke about is going to be linked very strongly to the link between our capacity. Do we have the right skills, capability? Do we have enough of the right skills, capacity? But more importantly, do we have the organizational culture to tie this all together? So in some businesses, in some contexts, there is been this culture of you've got to be under my nose for me to manage you. It's not possible in today's world because people have to be managed in a different way. And so if we're diagnosing, if we're thinking about business model and strategy and then diagnosing, we need to ask ourselves the question, do we have an enabling culture and what culture is necessary in today's world? How does that meet or match the link around where do we need capacity? How's that changed in our business? And what skill sets? Because often when we diagnose, something doesn't happen and so we blame the person where the capability lies, whereas often a bottleneck in a business isn't necessarily a capability issue, it's a capacity issue. People not doing things aren't necessarily either capability or capacity, they could be culture. Once we've thought about that, and I spend a bit of time on the strategic elements because they are the most important. From a governance point of view, and this is going back to the parts and especially the relationships, we've got to re-examine our policies and the principles upon which we're basing the business. And that is a governance. The reason I put top down there, that's a governance accountability. Governors have to be sitting and meeting and looking at re-examining our policy frameworks to ask the question, do we need to rewrite them? Do we need to put some in place for the short term? Because our policies determine what our processes are in the business, organizationally or departmentally, and our processes determine what our procedures or workflows are. That's the relationship. We often engineer it backwards because we do things, happen to have processes and then write the policy, but actually governors do it from the top down. They create the space within which the business operates through policies. And so thinking about that is absolutely critical. And so how well you implement your strategy is dependent on your governance structures. And then we've obviously got to do it right. And this is where the legalities come in, and it's recognizing that in business, all business is a set of relationships designed or formulated or formed to enable the making and implementation of decisions. If you think about business in that way, we've got to think about, well, what are the relationships? Are the relationships that we have in place and the nature of the relationships, are they right for the business and to achieve the strategic elements of the business? If so, we've obviously got to contract those relationships because in business, we're dealing with a legal entity and not just people. And so we have to manage those relationships internally and externally. We've got to set them up right based on our strategic risk management and corporate governance, and obviously get the legal inputs into the process. And then essential in governing, we've got to keep them right. As things change, so the relationships may change. And contracts, obviously, the challenge around contracts is a piece of paper is very valuable, but it's static. We've got to build into our relationships or into our contracts the flexibility required in relationships. And so when we think about, we've got to think strategy first, governance second, managing or contracting relationships third, because that's the fundamental fabric or framework within which our businesses lie or operate. And then lastly, we've got to think about how do we look and what are the elements in our business from a governance perspective. So we've determined a performance outcome in our strategy. We've identified products and services to deliver that. We've put people in positions, or we've designed positions, and we've put people in positions, all right, in our policy framework in order to deliver our products and services. And those people in positions govern the processes or run the processes and systems in the business. And so we've got to look and ask ourselves the question when we assure, are our processes and systems properly designed to give, when we audit our people, the performance of our people, is that properly designed? Is our organogram properly designed so that ultimately we can deliver our organizational promise, which is reflected in our products and services? And in thinking about building a resilient business, we've got to balance these four key, I call buckets of activity or thinking: our strategic elements, our corporate governance elements, the legalities or the compliance elements, and the assurance. And absolutely critical, this is an opportunity to review what we've done and to review how we are going to be doing things into the future. Big questions we're being faced about: how do we look and relook at our strategy? How do we look and test our governance structures? How do we understand the changes or the challenges from a legal point of view, and our assurance? And so I trust that this has been, and I know that there's been a lot of information, and I encourage you to revisit this and take your business apart in a sense. Get a whiteboard, get a flip chart, get a big piece of paper, and ask yourself the question: what are the elements that must be taken into account when we're thinking about the business? And as we close, please put any questions or comments in the chat or the question and answer box. And where should we begin? Where should we start the rebuilding or building process in our businesses? For some of us, they were really, really challenging. Our businesses are going to be scaled down. Some of us are going to be having to make some really, really tough decisions about all aspects of our business. For some of us, there are opportunities. For some of us, there are new things we can build. Some of us will be building new career paths individually, and some together with people. But underlying all of this is we need to think better so that we can learn better, so that we can act better at the end of the day. So I trust this has been valuable. And again, this quote by Kate McGahan: deep within every crisis is an opportunity for something beautiful. And I try, this is difficult, it's tough. There are some really ugly things going on in various systems, but I think if we think deeply enough, if we examine our own assumptions and expectations, our own businesses, our own values, there is the opportunity for something beautiful to come from this crisis. In closing, just to remind you of the half-day workshop that we're putting together some of these webinar elements into, revisiting some of the concepts I've spoken about today and in the previous webinars, with tools and templates to try to process some of the information more practically for your businesses. It's going to be a half-day online workshop. We're currently getting expressions of interest and finding out who's interested, and we'll be tying down the details of that shortly. So the information is out there. Please go online and tell us you're interested, and we'll also then be deploying that as often as is necessary over the next little while. So thank you for taking the time to join us online. I trust it has been valuable, and please complete the survey that comes up after the webinar has ended. Thanks once again. We look forward to seeing you online in the next weeks that lie ahead. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful Friday. Signing off. Stay safe and sanitized.